In 1968, a New York City subway engineer vanished on his late-night run. For 50 years his family believed the official story, that he abandoned his post and his entire train, leaving them with nothing but shame. But a discovery in an old attic changes everything. His sister finds a faded note that whispers a different truth. He never left. Her search for answers leads her deep beneath the city, to an unused tunnel hidden behind a strange, false wall. And when it's finally broken open, they find it, his entire train, sitting silently in the dark for half a century. But this was no simple disappearance. It was a cover-up. What secret was so terrible that an entire train, and everyone on it, had to be sealed away and erased from history? Subscribe now so you won't miss similar chilling stories on our channel in the future. And tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. The air in the attic was thick with the scent of forgotten things, cedar, dust, and the dry, sweet decay of paper. For Clara Mitchell, a woman whose life had been ordered by the clean, sterile rhythms of a hospital ward, the chaos was a quiet weight on her chest. At 62, her hands, once steady enough to thread a needle into a vein, now trembled slightly as she lifted the lid from another cardboard box. It was her Aunt Mary's attic, a tomb of memories she had been tasked with clearing out. Each object was a ghost, a stack of vinyl records, a wedding dress yellowed to the color of old cream, a box of letters tied with a brittle ribbon. Most of it was just stuff, the leftover pieces of a long life. But Clara worked methodically, just as she always had. A lifetime spent as a nurse had taught her that you find what's wrong by looking at everything, even the things that seem right. She was about to seal a box labeled "Old Paperwork" when her fingers brushed against something hard and leather, bound at the bottom. She pulled it out. It was a union dues ledger, its dark green cover faded and its spine cracked. Stamped in faint gold lettering were the words, "Transit Workers Union, Local 100." And below that, a date, 1968. A cold knot formed in Clara's stomach. 1968. The year everything broke. The year her brother, Thomas, disappeared. The official story was a simple, brutal one. A tale her mother had repeated until it had the force of gospel. Thomas Mitchell, a subway engineer with a wife and a future, had taken his train out for a late-night run and simply vanished. He'd abandoned his train. He'd abandoned his post. He'd abandoned his family. The word abandoned was a stain, one that had seeped into the very foundations of their family, leaving behind a permanent shame. Her mother had spoken his name only in whispers after that, as if he were a curse. Clara ran her thumb over the worn leather of the ledger. Why would Aunt Mary have kept this? Thomas was the only one in the family who worked for the transit authority. With a sense of dread and a flicker of something she couldn't name, she opened it. The pages were a neat grid of names and numbers, a history of men who paid their dues and did their jobs. She found his name easily, Thomas Mitchell. His signature, a confident loop she remembered from birthday cards, was next to payments for January, February, March. Then it stopped. Of course it did. He was gone by April. Clara felt the familiar old ache, a hollow space in her heart that had never quite healed. She was about to close the book, to put the ghost back in its box, when a small slip of paper fell from between the pages and drifted to the dusty floorboards. It was yellowed and fragile, folded into a tiny square. She picked it up carefully, her nurse's hands gentle, as if handling something precious and alive. She unfolded it. On it, written in her aunt's familiar, spidery pencil script, were just 5 words. A message from the grave. Find the train, he never left. The air left Clara's lungs in a rush. He never left. The words seemed to hum in the silent attic, vibrating with the weight of 50 years of unspoken truth. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. A command. All at once, the story that had defined her family, the story of shame and desertion, cracked open. A lie. It had all been a lie. A wave of emotions washed over her, shock, confusion, and then a fierce, burning hope that was so foreign it almost hurt. What if he hadn't abandoned them? What if something had happened to him? The thought was terrifying, but it was also a kind of release. Anything was better than the story they'd been forced to live with. Anything was better than believing the brother who sang folk songs to her, the man who fixed her bicycle chain with grease-stained fingers, was a coward who had simply walked away from his life. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to know. For her mother, for her family, but most of all for Thomas. She would uncover the truth, not to shame the past, but to restore his name. She finally had a direction, a North Star to follow in a half-century of darkness. Filled with a fragile, electrifying purpose, Clara fumbled for her phone, her hands still shaking. She needed to tell someone, to share the weight of this miracle. Her first thought was her cousin Howard. He was older, the son of Aunt Mary. He'd lived through it all too. He would understand. He had to. She dialed his number, her mind racing. Maybe he knew something. Maybe his mother had told him more. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice gruff and impatient. "Clara, what is it?" She took a shaky breath and the words tumbled out, a torrent of discovery and 50 years of pent-up questions. She told him about the attic, the ledger, the note. She told him what it said. "He never left, Howard." That's what she wrote. Aunt Mary knew something. There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. Clara waited, her hope swelling. He was processing it. He was remembering. Then he spoke, and his voice was not filled with wonder or curiosity. It was sharp. It was angry. "Are you out of your mind?" he snapped. The words hit her like a slap. "What are you talking about, Howard?" she asked, her voice small. "I'm talking about you, digging up shame for no reason." He spat. "That story is dead and buried, Clara. For a reason. My mother was a sentimental old woman. She probably wrote that in a fit of grief. Thomas ran away. He was a disgrace. End of story." Clara felt the hope in her chest curdle into ice. "But the note means nothing." He cut her off, his voice rising. "What do you think you're going to find? Some grand conspiracy? You're going to go around embarrassing this family all over again? We finally put it behind us. My father had to change his name at his job because of the shame Thomas brought on us. Don't you dare bring that back. Don't you dare." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He wasn't just dismissing her, he was attacking her. He was protecting the lie. The betrayal was so sudden, so absolute, it stole her breath. This wasn't the reaction of a man who shared her grief, it was the reaction of a man guarding a locked door. "I'm just trying to find the truth," she whispered, but the words felt weak, pathetic. "The truth?" Howard laughed, a short, ugly sound. "The truth is he left us, Clara, and you'd be wise to do the same. Leave it alone." The line went dead. Clara stood there in the silent, dusty attic, the phone still pressed to her ear. The joy of her discovery was gone, replaced by a cold, hard knot of defiance. The rift he had just torn open in their family wasn't a warning, it was a confirmation. He was afraid. He was afraid of what she might find. She looked down at the slip of paper in her hand. Find the train. He never left. It was no longer just a clue, it was a promise. And now, standing alone against the anger of her own family, it was a battle cry. She would find it, no matter what it cost her. Howard's angry words echoed in Clara's mind for days, a bitter poison that soured her newfound resolve. The family, the very thing she was trying to heal, was fracturing under the first bit of pressure. She felt isolated, a solitary soldier fighting a war no one else believed in. But the nurse in her, the part that had seen patients through their darkest nights, knew that you didn't quit just because you were afraid or alone. You followed the symptoms. And the symptom was Howard's fear. So she pushed his betrayal aside, packing it down into the same deep place where she kept the rest of her grief, and focused on the only lead she had, the train. To find the train, she needed to talk to the men who had lived their lives in the dark labyrinth beneath the city, the men who had worked alongside her brother. Most of them were gone now, their names faded from union rosters, but a few old-timers still gathered at a diner in Brooklyn, a place called the Trolley Stop, where the coffee was strong and the memories were long. The diner was a capsule of a bygone era. The air hung thick with the smell of fried bacon and day-old newsprint. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through the large front window, illuminating a row of men sitting at the counter, their backs stooped with age, their hands wrapped around thick ceramic mugs. They were the ghosts of the Transit Workers Union, their faces etched with the lines of 1,000 midnight runs through rattling tunnels. Clara felt a tremor of anxiety. These were Thomas's people. What if they saw her as an intruder, stirring up a past they wanted to forget? She took a deep breath, walked to the counter, and ordered coffee for the whole row. It was a simple gesture, an offering of peace. One by one they turned, their eyes a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She introduced herself softly. "I'm Clara Mitchell. Thomas Mitchell was my brother." A flicker of recognition passed between them, a silent language of shared history. An old man with kind eyes and hands, knotted with arthritis, patted the empty stool next to him. His name was Sal. For the first hour, she just listened. They spoke of the old days, of the grit and the grime, the camaraderie and the constant, humming danger of the third rail. They remembered Thomas. They called him Steady Tommy, a man who knew his machine, who never took risks. A good man. The words were a balm on Clara's wounded heart. For the first time in 50 years, she was hearing about the brother she knew, not the phantom her mother had cursed. Feeling a surge of courage, she pulled out the ledger and the small, folded note. She laid them on the counter like a sacred offering. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My aunt wrote that he never left. I think something happened to him down there, in the tunnels." The men fell silent, their eyes fixed on the note. The comfortable nostalgia in the diner evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy quiet. Sal shook his head slowly. "A lot of things happened down there, miss. Things people don't talk about." Another man grunted in agreement. "City buries its mistakes deep." They were closing ranks. The fear she'd sensed in Howard's voice was here too, older and more deeply rooted. Her hope began to drain away, leaving a familiar cold dread. This was a mistake. She was chasing a ghost story, just like Howard had said. Just as despair began to set in, a man at the far end of the counter, one who hadn't spoken a word, cleared his throat. His name was Arthur, and his voice was a low rumble, like a distant train. "I remember that night," he said, and every head turned towards him. "The night your brother disappeared. They shut down the whole A-line express track, rerouted us all. Said it was an emergency structural check near Hoyt-Schermerhorn." He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Thing is, there was no check. No work crews went in. The next day, everything was back to normal, except for Tommy and his train." He looked directly at Clara, his gaze intense. "And there was a section of tunnel off that line. An old service spur. Heard a rumor a few days later they'd sealed it up. Concrete. Like they were walling up a tomb." The words hung in the air. Electric. A sealed tunnel. A walled-up tomb. It was real. A jolt of adrenaline shot through Clara, so powerful it made her dizzy. Hope, fierce and undeniable, flooded back into her. This was it. This was the trail. The men were all talking at once now, a flood of fragmented memories unleashed by Arthur's confession. Sal, the man next to her, suddenly fell silent. He was staring at her, a strange, pained look on his face. Slowly, as if it pained him, he reached into the deep pocket of his worn jacket. His hand trembled as he pulled something out and placed it on the counter. It was a brass subway whistle, dull with age but heavy and solid. Scratched into its side were 2 small letters, T. M. Thomas Mitchell. "I found this," Sal said, his voice thick with emotion. "On the tracks the morning after. Near that spur Arthur mentioned. I knew it was Tommy's. He never went anywhere without it. He wouldn't have just dropped it." He pushed it towards her. "I kept it all these years. I should have given it to your mother, but I was scared. We were all scared." Clara reached out and closed her fingers around the whistle. It was still cold from the depths of Sal's pocket, but to her it felt warm, alive with her brother's presence. Tears streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. It was proof. Tangible, undeniable proof. He hadn't abandoned his post. He was there, on the job, when something terrible happened. This small piece of metal destroyed 50 years of lies. It was a moment of pure, blinding vindication. She wasn't digging up shame, she was reclaiming his honor. In that moment of triumph, a shadow fell over their table. A man was standing there, his presence so jarringly out of place, it was like a tear in the fabric of the old diner. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a perfectly knotted tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His smile was smooth and practiced, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The old men at the counter stiffened, their easy camaraderie gone in an instant. The man's eyes landed on Clara. "You must be Mrs. Mitchell. My name is Richard Cain. I'm a safety advocate with the City Transit Authority." He offered a hand, but Clara didn't take it. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. How did he know her name? How did he know where to find her? "I understand you've been inquiring about certain historical infrastructure matters," Cain said, his smile never wavering. It was the smile of a predator. "While I admire your interest in our city's history, I'm here to offer a bit of friendly advice. Some of those old tunnels are structurally unsound, dangerous. It's best to let sleeping tunnels lie." He wasn't advising, he was warning. His voice was quiet, but every word was a threat, cloaked in the sterile language of bureaucracy. "Order before truth, Mrs. Mitchell. It's what keeps this city from falling apart." He glanced at the brass whistle still clutched in her hand, and his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he turned and walked out, leaving a profound silence in his wake. The warm, hopeful atmosphere of the diner was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating fear. The old men wouldn't meet her eyes. She was no longer just a woman searching for her lost brother. She was a threat. And the system, the powerful, faceless system that had buried him 50 years ago, had just sent its messenger to tell her to stop digging. He hadn't just warned her off. He'd drawn a battle line. The fight wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about her future. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this man would do anything to make sure the truth stayed buried right alongside her brother. Richard Cain's veiled threat lingered in the air of the diner long after he was gone, a poison that seeped into Clara's bones. The hope she had felt holding Thomas's whistle now felt fragile, breakable. She was a retired nurse, a grandmother. What did she know about fighting a man like that? A man who moved with the silent confidence of the powerful, who spoke in threats disguised as concerns. She knew how to read a patient's chart, how to find a vein in the dark, but she didn't know how to navigate the murky, dangerous tunnels of city corruption. She was out of her depth, and for the first time she was truly scared. The men from the diner, once so open and full of memories, now offered her little more than sympathetic nods before shuffling out into the afternoon light, leaving her alone with her brother's whistle and a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight. She realized with chilling clarity that Cain hadn't just been warning her. He had been isolating her. But the fear did not make her want to retreat. It sharpened her resolve. She wasn't a reckless woman, but she was stubborn, and she had spent a lifetime advocating for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Thomas couldn't speak, so she would have to be his voice. If she was going to fight a man who operated from within the system, she needed an ally who knew the system's weaknesses. Someone who, like her, believed in finding the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. After a few calls to a friend whose husband had been a cop, she got a name: Miguel Alvarez. A retired NYPD detective who had a reputation for being a bulldog, a man who'd been pushed into early retirement for asking too many questions about a case his superiors wanted closed. He was now a community historian, a keeper of the city's forgotten stories. Perfect. She found him in a cramped, book-lined office at the back of a local library, a place that smelled of old paper and quiet dedication. Alvarez was a man in his late 60s, with a face that looked tired but kind, and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to her story without interruption, his hands steepled, his gaze steady. He jotted notes in a small, spiral-bound notebook, a habit from his detective days. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding. She had laid everything bare: the note, the old men at the diner, the brass whistle, the chilling visit from Richard Cain. This was it. If he turned her away, she had nowhere else to go. Alvarez leaned back in his squeaky chair, his eyes fixed on her. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, "you have a compelling story. But it's also a ghost story. Rumors, a 50-year-old note, and a man in a suit telling you to back off. In my experience, that can mean anything from a real cover-up to a simple case of a bureaucrat trying to avoid paperwork on an old, unstable tunnel." The disappointment was a physical blow. He didn't believe her. He saw her as just another grieving woman chasing shadows. Her shoulders slumped. "It's not a ghost story," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's my brother." She fought back the urge to cry, to beg. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She reached into her purse and took out the brass whistle. She placed it on the desk between them. It made a soft, heavy sound on the wood. "His initials are on it," she said quietly. "Sal gave it to me. He said he found it near the sealed spur the morning after." Alvarez leaned forward, his professional skepticism melting away as he looked at the small, tangible object. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at it, his detective's eyes seeing not just a whistle, but a piece of evidence, a piece of a man left behind. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, the hunter's instinct. This was the kind of puzzle he couldn't leave unsolved. "A man like Richard Cain doesn't make house calls to diners for paperwork," he said, more to himself than to her. He finally looked up at her, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "All right, Clara, let's go dig up some ghosts." The feeling of relief was so immense it almost buckled her knees. She wasn't alone anymore. With Alvarez by her side, the fight felt possible. He was everything she wasn't: methodical, connected, and utterly unafraid of the city's bureaucracy. He warned her that Cain would have buried everything under layers of red tape, but Alvarez knew where to find the cracks. They spent the next week in the musty city archives, a place where history went to die. Alvarez navigated the labyrinth of files and ledgers with an expert's ease, teaching Clara how to read the city's secret language, and then they found it. Tucked away in a dusty box of outdated engineering schematics was a large, rolled-up track map from 1965. As they unrolled it across a large table, Clara saw it almost immediately, a faint, penciled line branching off the A-line near the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station, a line that didn't exist on any official map. It was crude, hand-drawn, a ghost on the page. "There it is," Alvarez breathed, his finger tracing the faint line. "Your sealed spur." Hope, bright and thrilling, surged through Clara. They had a map. They had a location. They were close. So close. That evening they went to find it. The address led them to a desolate, forgotten corner of Brooklyn, under an overpass where the constant roar of traffic overhead felt like the city's heartbeat. There, behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, was an old rusted metal door set into the concrete retaining wall. It was a maintenance entrance, long abandoned. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was exactly the kind of place where a secret could be kept. "This has to be it," Clara whispered, her excitement making it hard to breathe. The gate was locked with a heavy, rusted chain, but the fence was low in one spot. Driven by a desperate, reckless urgency, Clara made a decision. She knew it was wrong, she knew it was dangerous, but the thought of Cain getting there first, of him destroying whatever was behind that wall, was more terrifying than the risk of getting caught. "We have to go in," she said, her voice firm. Alvarez looked at her, then at the fence, a flicker of his old-world caution in his eyes. But he saw the look on her face, the fierce determination of a woman who had waited 50 years for this moment. He nodded grimly. They climbed the fence. The air on the other side was cold and still. They made their way to the maintenance entrance, their footsteps echoing in the strange quiet. But as they got closer, a sharp, chemical smell hit them. The smell of fresh concrete. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, landing on the tunnel entrance. It was gone. In its place was a smooth, gray, perfectly flat wall of new concrete. It was still dark and damp in places. It hadn't just been sealed 50 years ago, it had been sealed again. Recently. "No," Clara breathed, the word a raw, wounded sound. Defeat washed over her, a bitter, icy tide. They were too late. Cain had beaten them to it. He knew they were coming. As they stood there, paralyzed by the shock and the blatant, arrogant display of power, a blinding white light flooded the area. "Nye PD! Don't move! Hands where I can see them!" voices shouted. They were surrounded, and standing just behind the uniformed officers, bathed in the glow of the headlights, was Richard Cain. He had a look of calm, paternal disappointment on his face, the look of a man who had simply caught two naughty children. "Trespassing on city property is a serious offense," he said, his voice carrying easily in the night air. "I tried to warn you, Mrs. Mitchell, for your own safety. It was a trap. He had led them here. He had waited for them to make a mistake." The humiliation was a burning fire in Clara's chest. But Cain wasn't finished. He turned his cold gaze on Alvarez. "And you, detective? A man of your standing should know better." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the Historical Society. Your research permits are hereby revoked, permanently." The blow was catastrophic. In one move, Cain had not only sealed the tunnel for good, but he had also destroyed her only ally, stripping him of his credibility and his livelihood. Clara looked at Alvarez, whose face was a mask of stunned disbelief and utter defeat. The hope that had carried them this far was extinguished, leaving behind nothing but the cold, bitter ashes of their failure. She wasn't just back where she started, she was worse off. She had brought a good man down with her, and the man who held her brother's secret was now untouchable, watching them from the shadows with a victor's smile. The shame of being caught, of being so easily outmaneuvered, was a bitter pill. But what truly crushed Clara's spirit was the look on Alvarez's face as they were escorted away from the freshly sealed tunnel. It was the hollowed-out look of a man who had been professionally executed, his life's passions stripped from him by a well-dressed monster with a pen. The guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. Her quest for the truth had cost a good man his reputation. The trespassing charge was a slap on the wrist, a small fine she paid without a second thought, but the real damage was done. Cain hadn't wanted to arrest them, he'd wanted to cripple them, and he had succeeded. When she got home, the one person she wanted to talk to, the one person whose steady presence had always been her anchor, was waiting for her. Her daughter, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale with worry, a newspaper spread out in front of her. The headline was small, buried in the city section, but the words jumped out like an accusation: "Community historian loses permit after trespassing incident." Emily looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger that Clara had not seen since she was a rebellious teenager. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight. "I got a call from Cousin Howard. He told me everything. Trespassing? Police? Who is this Richard Cain?" The questions were a barrage, each one hitting Clara like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, the exhaustion of the last few days settling over her like a shroud. She tried to explain, to make Emily understand the note, the whistle, the sealed tunnel. She spoke of Thomas, of their duty to his memory. But the more she talked, the more the worry in Emily's eyes hardened into something else: exasperation. "This isn't about Uncle Thomas anymore, is it?" Emily said, her voice rising. "This is about you. You've become obsessed. You're putting yourself in danger. You're ruining a man's career. And for what? A 50-year-old rumor? Mom, he's gone. He left us. Why can't you just accept that?" The words, so similar to Howard's, felt like a betrayal from the person she trusted most in the world. Coming from her own daughter, the accusation that she was selfish, that this was just for her, cut deeper than any threat Cain could make. "He didn't leave," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I know it. I can feel it." "Feelings aren't evidence." Emily shot back, slamming her hand on the table, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. "This man, Cain, he's powerful. He's dangerous. I'm a paralegal, Mom. I know how these people operate. They don't just stop. What if he comes after you? What if he hurts you? Have you even thought about that? Have you thought about me?" The raw fear in Emily's voice finally broke through Clara's haze of determination. She looked at her daughter, her strong, sensible daughter, now terrified for her mother's safety, and saw the true cost of her quest. It wasn't just her own life she was risking. It was the peace of mind of the one person she had left. The kitchen, usually a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a courtroom where Clara stood accused. And maybe Emily was right. Maybe she was being reckless. Maybe the weight of the past was too heavy to lift. The argument ended with no resolution, just a heavy, wounded silence hanging between them. Emily left soon after, her parting words a quiet, desperate plea. "Please, Mom, just let it go." For the next few days Clara tried. She put the old ledger back in its box. She put the whistle in a drawer. She tried to go back to her quiet, ordered life of retirement. She tended to her garden. She read her books, but the silence in her house was deafening. It was a silence filled with the ghost of her brother and the fractured relationships she had left in her wake. The feeling of defeat was suffocating. Cain had won. He had turned her own family against her. One evening, unable to sleep, she found herself wandering into the spare room where she kept old family photo albums. She pulled one from the shelf, its red leather cover soft and worn. She opened it to a picture of herself and Thomas as children, sitting on the steps of their old brownstone, grinning at the camera. He had his arm around her, a protective, big brother gesture. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, who held the seat until she found her balance. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't a man who ran away. Sifting through a box of loose papers from that era, her fingers brushed against something thin and stiff. A postcard. The last one he ever sent, mailed from a depot in Queens just days before he disappeared. She had read it 100 times over the years. The front was a cheap, colorized picture of the Unisphere from the World's Fair. She turned it over. The message was short, almost an afterthought. "Clara, working a lot of overtime. The bigwigs are pushing us hard. Something about a new project. Tell Mom I'll be there for Sunday dinner. Love, Tommy." Something about a new project. The phrase, which had meant nothing to her before, now seemed to leap off the page. It wasn't just a routine run. He was involved in something new, something the bigwigs were pushing. A detail. A tiny crack in the wall of lies. A renewed sense of purpose, quiet but fierce, began to burn in her chest. This was not over. Letting go wasn't an option. It would be a betrayal of the boy in the photograph, the man who wrote this card. She held the postcard to her chest, whispering a silent prayer into the empty room. "I'm not giving up on you, Thomas. I will make this right. I promise." It was a moment of quiet, intimate resolve, a reaffirmation of her vow, this time made not in a dusty attic but in the heart of her home, surrounded by the memories she was fighting to reclaim. The fragile peace of her decision was shattered the next morning. Her phone rang. It was a local news reporter. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling about an interview given by your cousin, Mr. Howard Mitchell." A cold dread washed over Clara. She could barely form the words. "What interview?" The reporter was direct. "He contacted us. He wanted to set the record straight about his uncle, Thomas Mitchell. He describes him as a troubled, reckless man who had problems with gambling and was planning to leave the city long before he disappeared." Clara's blood ran cold. The lies were so specific, so cruel. Howard was actively, publicly destroying Thomas's memory. It wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a public execution. The reporter continued, "Mr. Mitchell said he's concerned that recent unfounded family rumors are dishonoring the truth and causing pain. He paints a very different picture of your brother. He says the family has known for years that Thomas simply ran away from his responsibilities. The humiliation was a physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. Howard, her own flesh and blood, was working with Cain. Or worse, working for him. He was feeding the official story to the press, painting Clara as a delusional old woman and Thomas as a scoundrel. This wasn't just a warning shot anymore. This was a declaration of war. And Cain, through Howard, was using her own family as the weapon. He was not just trying to stop her, he was trying to destroy her, to utterly discredit her so that no one would ever listen to her again. The newspaper article was a declaration of war. Howard's betrayal was so complete, so publicly devastating, that it almost worked. Clara felt the sting of public shame, the kind that makes you want to draw the curtains and never go outside again. Friends from her old nursing job called, their voices laced with pity. Neighbors gave her sad, knowing looks over the garden fence. They believed the lies. They saw her not as a determined sister seeking justice, but as a confused old woman clinging to a fantasy. The humiliation was a corrosive acid, eating away at her resolve. For a full day, she let it win. She stayed inside, phone off the hook, letting the silence of her home echo the silence from her family. Cain and Howard hadn't just built a wall of concrete. They had built a wall of shame around her, isolating her completely. But as the second day dawned, something else began to burn through the shame. Rage, a cold, hard anger she hadn't felt in years. How dare they? How dare they take her brother's good name and drag it through the mud? How dare they try to make her the crazy one? This was no longer just about finding a train, it was about fighting back. Just as she was wrestling with this newfound fury, there was a knock at her door. It was Alvarez. He looked older, more tired than he had just a week ago, the loss of his permits having taken a visible toll. But the fire was back in his eyes. He held up a copy of the newspaper, his expression grim. "I saw this," he said, his voice a low growl. "Cain is using your cousin to shut you down. This isn't the work of a man trying to avoid paperwork, Clara. This is the work of a man hiding a body." His words, blunt and terrible, were exactly what she needed to hear. She wasn't alone. "He took my permits, my access, my credibility," Alvarez continued, stepping inside. "But he didn't take my friends, and he didn't take my memory." He explained that while he could no longer officially access city records, he still knew people. Retired foremen, grizzled sandhogs who had spent their lives digging these tunnels. Men who operated on a code of loyalty, not bureaucracy. Men who despised suits like Richard Cain. He had a plan. An unofficial one. A dangerous one. "There's more than one way into that part of the system," he said, a glint of the old detective in his eye. "We go back, but not through the front door." A thrill of fear and exhilaration shot through Clara. This was it. No more archives, no more asking for permission. This was the point of no return. The anger had solidified into a hard diamond of purpose. She would not be shamed into silence. She would not let them win. A few nights later, under the cloak of a moonless sky, they met Alvarez's contact, a retired tunnel worker named Gus, near a different, less conspicuous maintenance hatch several blocks from the one Cain had sealed. Gus was a man built like a bulldog, with hands that looked like they could crush rock. He looked them both over, his eyes lingering on Clara. "You sure about this, lady? It ain't a walk in the park down there." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "My brother is down there," she said, her voice steady. That was all the answer he needed. He grunted, pulled a heavy crowbar from a canvas bag, and pried open the rusted hatch. A blast of cool, damp, metallic-smelling air rushed up to meet them. It smelled like the Earth's secrets. Gus led the way, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. He moved with a sureness born of a lifetime spent underground, navigating a maze of intersecting tunnels, his only guide the subtle changes in the walls and the hum of distant machinery. They were in the city's metallic belly, a place of shadows and secrets. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped. "This is as far as I go," he said, gesturing with his flashlight. "The sealed spur should be just beyond that wall. You hear me? Knock 3 times when you want out. And don't get lost." He handed Alvarez a heavy-duty hammer and a chisel, then disappeared back into the darkness, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere nearby. The wall in front of them wasn't new concrete like the one at the main entrance. This was older, rougher. The original seal. Adrenaline pulsed through Clara's veins as Alvarez positioned the chisel. The first strike of the hammer against the metal was deafening, the sound echoing endlessly down the dark tunnel. It felt like they were trying to break into a tomb. It was slow, grueling work. As Alvarez chipped away, a small, dark object embedded in the concrete caught the beam of Clara's flashlight. "Wait," she said, her voice tight. She reached out and brushed away the dust. It was a conductor's watch, its face cracked, its metal casing rusted and pitted, and its hands were frozen at 11:47, the time. The exact time Thomas's train had been scheduled to pass this junction, the time it had vanished from the dispatch board. It was as if time itself had stopped right here, in this spot, 50 years ago. Proof. More proof. It was all real. Her heart hammered with a mixture of terror and vindication. Just as a wave of hope washed over her, a new, chilling thought took root. She remembered something from her research in the archives. A name on a staffing roster from 1968, a man who worked in transit safety. The name was Arthur Cain. Alvarez, she said, her voice trembling. Richard Cain's father. His name was Arthur. He was a safety chief in '68. This cover-up, it might not have started with Richard. It might be generational. The implication was staggering. This wasn't just about protecting a city secret. It was about protecting a family legacy built on a terrible lie. The revelation gave them new strength, a new fury. Alvarez swung the hammer with renewed vigor, and with a final splintering crack, a piece of the wall gave way, revealing a black, empty space beyond. They were about to break through. Victory was inches away. Suddenly, a low, ominous rumble echoed from the ceiling above them. A shower of dust and small pebbles rained down. "Get back!" Alvarez yelled, pulling Clara away from the wall just as a large section of the tunnel's concrete ceiling groaned and then collapsed, crashing down exactly where they had been standing. A cloud of thick, choking dust filled the air. They scrambled backward, coughing, their hearts pounding with a primal fear. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. The timing was too perfect. The rumble hadn't felt like a natural shift. It felt like an impact from above. Staged. Someone knew they were here. A moment later, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely read it. There were just 3 words. The same 3 words Cain had spoken to her in the diner. Order before truth. A cold, paralyzing terror seized her. He had been watching them. He had known their plan. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an attempt on their lives. He had tried to bury them alive, to make them a part of the secret they were trying to uncover. The dust from the ceiling collapse settled slowly, coating everything in a fine, gray powder. Clara's ears rang from the deafening crash, her lungs burned. But the terror that had seized her a moment before was already crystallizing into something else, something cold and hard. Defiance. Cain's message, meant to paralyze her with fear, did the opposite. It was a confession. He wouldn't be trying to kill them if there wasn't something of immense value behind that wall. He had overplayed his hand. He had shown them just how terrified he was of what they might find. "He tried to kill us," Alvarez coughed, his face pale in the flashlight beam, a mixture of disbelief and fury in his eyes. That was no accident. He looked at the pile of rubble blocking their path, then back at the hole they had painstakingly chiseled in the wall. The attack had knocked loose another large section. The hole was bigger now, big enough to crawl through. A choice hung in the thick, dusty air. They could knock 3 times, retreat into the safety of the dark tunnels, and let Cain win. Or they could push forward into the unknown, into the very heart of the secret he was willing to kill to protect. For Clara, there was no choice. The image of her brother's face from the old photograph, the memory of her daughter's pleading eyes, the sting of Howard's public betrayal, it all coalesced into a single, unshakable conviction. She had to know. "We're going in," she said, her voice raspy but firm. It was not a question. Alvarez met her gaze, and after a long, heavy moment, he gave a slow, determined nod. This was no longer just her fight. Cain had made it his, too. Alvarez went first, squeezing his broad shoulders through the jagged opening. Clara followed, her heart pounding against her ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, almost sacred anticipation. The air on the other side was different, colder, stiller. It was the air of a place that had been sealed off from the world, a pocket of time that had not been breathed in half a century. As she straightened up, the beams of their flashlights cut through the darkness, and the breath caught in her throat. It was there. A subway car. A full, intact 1960s Re-32 Brightliner, its stainless steel exterior impossibly preserved, coated in a thick blanket of gray dust. It sat on the tracks in perfect, eerie silence, as if it had simply stopped for a moment and the conductor had stepped away, intending to return. The sight was so surreal, so impossible, that for a moment all she could do was stare. The train. After all this time, all the whispers and warnings and betrayals, she had found the train. Tears of relief and awe welled in her eyes. It was real. Her aunt's note was real. Her brother's story wasn't over. A wave of triumphant joy washed over her, so potent it felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. They had done it. They had beaten him. They approached the car cautiously. Their footsteps, the only sound in the cavernous silence. The doors were closed. Alvarez tried the handle on the conductor's cab, but it was locked. They moved along the side of the car, their flashlights playing over the grimy windows. And then they saw it. Resting on the engineer's seat, just inside the front window, was a dark blue, peaked cap, the kind the transit workers wore. Thomas's cap. It was sitting there, perfectly placed, as if he had just taken it off and set it down. Clara pressed her hand against the cold glass, a sob escaping her lips. It was a relic, a ghost, a final, heartbreaking piece of her brother. He had been here. He had sat in that very seat. This was where his life had stopped. The wave of triumph crashed and receded, leaving behind a profound and aching sorrow. The joy of discovery was instantly replaced by the grim reality of the tomb they had just entered. This wasn't a victory. It was a gravesite. Alvarez found a side door that had been forced slightly ajar, just enough to pry open. With a groaning screech of metal on metal that echoed like a scream, the door slid open. The smell that rolled out was dry and musty, the scent of stale air and forgotten things. They stepped inside, and the world fell away. The car was a time capsule. Old advertisements for cigarettes and Broadway shows lined the walls, their colors faded but still recognizable. The vinyl seats were cracked and dusty. It was as if the bustling, vibrant life of 1968 had been instantly frozen, then left to slowly decay in the dark. But as their eyes adjusted, the initial sense of awe gave way to a creeping dread. This was no ordinary train car. Something was wrong. There were blankets, old wool ones, neatly folded on some of the seats. A few empty cans of food, the old-fashioned kind you opened with a key, were tucked into a corner. And then Clara saw the scratchings. On the metal wall next to one of the doors, words had been etched into the paint with something sharp, like a key or a piece of glass. The letters were frantic, desperate, trapped. Another message was scratched below it. Day 4. Water is gone. And another, fainter, God help us. A cold horror, deeper and more visceral than any fear she had felt before, washed over Clara. This wasn't just about Thomas's disappearance. There were other people here, passengers, trapped with him. They hadn't just sealed up a train, they had sealed up a tomb with living people inside. The cover-up wasn't about a missing engineer. It was about mass murder. The full, monstrous weight of the secret crushed the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, a hand flying to her mouth. This was what Cain and his father had buried. Not an accident, not a disappearance, but a crime so horrific it defied comprehension. Alvarez was already moving through the car, his detective's instincts on high alert. He found a small, leather-bound diary tucked between a seat cushion and the wall. He opened it, his flashlight beam illuminating the neat, cursive handwriting of a woman. The last entry was dated April 15, 1968, 4 days after Thomas's train went missing. He says they are coming for us, it read. The man from the authority, he promised. But the air is getting thin. I don't think he's coming back. Before they could process the diary's horrifying last words, a loud, jarring noise echoed from the tunnel behind them. A metallic clang, followed by a heavy, grinding sound. They spun around, their flashlights cutting back toward the hole in the wall through which they had entered. The sound was coming from the other side, from the main tunnel where Gus was supposed to be waiting. It was the sound of the heavy maintenance hatch being slammed shut, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a heavy bar being dropped into place, locking it from the outside. A new, sickening wave of dread washed over Clara. Gus was supposed to be their way out. Alvarez pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. They were deep underground, cut off from the world. He pounded on the side of the train car. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks. Then again. And again. But the only answer was the echoing silence of the tomb. No one was coming. Cain hadn't just tried to crush them. He had failed, so now he was doing what his father had done 50 years ago. He was sealing them in. He was leaving them to die. They were trapped, just like Thomas, just like his passengers. The finality of the sound of the maintenance hatch slamming shut was absolute. It was the sound of a coffin lid closing. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara's shock. The air in the sealed tunnel, which had moments ago felt thick with history, now felt thin, finite. They were breathing the same stale air that the passengers of this ghost train had breathed in their final desperate hours. Alvarez, ever the detective, was already thinking, his mind racing past the fear. "Gus wouldn't do this," he said, his voice a low, hard rasp. "He was one of us. Cain must have gotten to him, or followed him." But the reason didn't matter. The result was the same. They were trapped. As Alvarez began to methodically check the walls of the tunnel, his flashlight beam sweeping across the damp concrete searching for any other opening, any weakness, Clara felt a different kind of horror creeping in, one that had nothing to do with their immediate danger. It was the chilling, sickening realization of betrayal on a scale she could never have imagined. Howard, her cousin. His public denouncement of Thomas, his carefully crafted lies about a gambling problem. It wasn't just him trying to protect the family from old shame. It was calculated. It was malicious. It was a part of this. Cain wasn't working alone. Clara sank onto one of the dusty subway seats, the fragile vinyl cracking under her weight. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so ugly, so monstrous, that it made her physically sick. Howard had abandoned a promising career as an engineer years ago, right around the time the city was awarding contracts for a massive redevelopment project near the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station. A project that had made him a very wealthy man. A project built on land that would have been worthless if an entire subway line running underneath it had to be excavated to recover a lost train. He hadn't been protecting a shameful family memory. He had been protecting his fortune. A fortune built on the silence surrounding this tomb. He knew. All these years, while her mother withered from the grief of a son who abandoned her, Howard knew the truth. He had stood at family funerals, eaten at holiday dinners, and looked her in the eye, all while knowing that her brother, his own cousin, had been buried alive beneath the city, a sacrifice for his greed. The magnitude of his treachery was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. This was not just a citywide conspiracy, it was a deeply personal one. The shame that had defined her family for 50 years wasn't a tragic misunderstanding. It was a lie he had profited from. The fury she felt was so pure, so white-hot, it burned away her fear. Cain was a monster, but he was a stranger. Howard was family. His betrayal felt like a poison injected directly into her heart. While Alvarez continued his desperate search for an exit, Clara's nursing instincts kicked in, her mind shifting from the paralyzing betrayal to the immediate, crushing reality of their situation. The diary. The scratches on the wall. The people on this train hadn't died in an accident. An accident would have meant wreckage, chaos. This was orderly, deliberate. Thomas's train, probably full of the last late-night commuters, had been diverted into this service spur. And then, the tunnel was sealed. It wasn't just a cover-up of a structural failure or a train malfunction. This was an extermination. The city, or at least men like Arthur Cain, had decided that the lives of a few dozen ordinary people were less important than avoiding a scandal or derailing a lucrative construction project. They had buried them alive and walked away. The scale of the evil was breathtaking. This secret wasn't just about Thomas, it was about all of them. The nameless, forgotten passengers whose families, like hers, were probably told a lie, that their loved ones had just walked away from their lives. The pain and the injustice of it all overwhelmed her. All those families, living with the same shame and confusion that had haunted hers for decades. The truth wasn't just for Thomas anymore, it was for all of them. Her thoughts turned to Emily. What would her daughter think when she didn't come home? The fear that had tightened Emily's face at the kitchen table flooded back into Clara's memory. She had promised to be more careful. She had broken that promise. A wave of profound guilt washed over her, a more immediate and painful emotion than even her rage at Howard. In her relentless pursuit of justice for the dead, she had been careless with the hearts of the living. She thought of Emily finding out she was gone, of her living the rest of her life with the same kind of unresolved grief that had destroyed her own mother. The cycle of pain would continue. She couldn't let that happen. She would not let her daughter's last memory of her be one of anger and fear. Taking a shaky breath, she pulled out her phone. The no-service icon glared back at her. But she knew that sometimes, even with no bars, a device could still hold onto a sliver of a signal. It was a long shot, a desperate hope. She opened her video recorder. The phone's small light cast a ghostly pale glow on her face. She looked into the lens, trying to find the right words, the last words she might ever say to her child. "Emily," she began, her voice cracking with emotion, "if you're seeing this, it means I didn't make it out, and I am so sorry. I know you were worried, and you were right to be. But I need you to know why I did this." She paused, gathering her strength, her voice growing steadier, filled with the moral certainty that had driven her this far. "I found him, honey. I found Uncle Thomas. He didn't abandon us. He was stolen from us, and he wasn't alone." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted Emily to see the truth in her eyes. There were others, innocent people. They were all buried down here, silenced so that powerful men could get what they wanted. Your cousin Howard, he knew. He helped them hide it. She let that terrible truth hang in the air for a moment. This was never just about the past. It's about the truth. And the truth, no matter how much it hurts, is all we really have. It's what sets us free. Please, don't let them silence this story. Don't let them win. The truth will set us all free, Emily. Even if I don't make it out to see it. She finished recording, her hand trembling. It was a prayer, a confession, and a final plea, sent out into the digital ether from the bottom of a grave. In that quiet, intimate moment, trapped in the darkness, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice. She had risked everything for this. And now, all that was left was to see if the truth was powerful enough to break through 50 years of lies and solid rock. After recording the message to Emily, a strange calm settled over Clara. The terror of being trapped remained, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but the act of speaking the truth aloud had given her a focus beyond fear. She and Alvarez were no longer just victims, they were witnesses. Their survival was now inextricably linked to the survival of the story. While Clara had been recording her message, Alvarez had been systematically exploring the confines of their prison. He hadn't found another exit, but he had found something else. "Clara," he called, his voice tight with urgency. "Over here." He was at the far end of the sealed spur, his flashlight trained on a rusted circular grate set into the wall about 10 feet up. "Storm drain access," he said, the words echoing in the confined space. "It's an old one, probably hasn't been used in decades. But if it connects to the main drainage system," he didn't need to finish. It was a chance, a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. The problem was getting to it. It was too high to reach. Just then a low, distant rumble vibrated through the concrete floor. It was different from the earlier, staged collapse. This was a deeper, more sustained groan. Alvarez put his ear to the tunnel wall. "That's not machinery," he said, a new note of alarm in his voice. "That's water. A lot of it." On the surface, a storm was rolling in, one of the violent summer tempests that could turn the city's streets into rivers and its ancient drainage systems into raging torrents. The clock that had been ticking on their air supply had just been replaced by a much faster, more violent one. Their tomb was about to become a watery grave. Panic, raw and immediate, flared again. There was no time to think, only to act. Using the hammer he'd brought to break through the wall, Alvarez began striking the heavy bolts holding a steel maintenance ladder to the side of the train car. The clang of metal on metal was a frantic, desperate rhythm against the growing rumble of the approaching water. He managed to break 2 of the 4 bolts, but the others wouldn't budge. "It's no good," he grunted, breathing heavily. "We need more leverage." Clara's mind, honed by years of emergency room problem solving, kicked into gear. She looked around the dimly lit train car, her eyes scanning for anything they could use. Her gaze fell on the long steel poles that ran the length of the car for passengers to hold. "The poles," she said, pointing. "If we can break one free." It was a desperate, almost impossible idea, but it was all they had. Together, they threw their weight against one of the vertical poles, rocking it back and forth, the metal groaning in protest. Finally, with a screech of tortured steel, it ripped free from its floor mounting. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it was the tool they needed. Using the pole as a massive lever, Alvarez was able to pry the remaining bolts of the ladder loose. With a final, groaning tear, it came free. Water was already beginning to seep in at the far end of the tunnel, a dark, creeping stain on the dusty floor. They dragged the heavy ladder to the wall and propped it up against the storm drain, its top rung falling just short of the grate. Alvarez went first, scrambling up the unsteady ladder. He reached the grate and pushed. It was rusted solid. He braced himself and kicked at it, his grunts of effort echoing in the tunnel. Nothing. The water was rising faster now, swirling around their ankles, shockingly cold. Clara could hear it pouring in from somewhere further down the line, a terrifying, rushing sound. "It's no good!" Alvarez shouted down, his voice laced with desperation. "I can't move it!" He kicked again, a final, furious effort, and this time there was a sharp crack. A piece of the rusted grate broke off, leaving a jagged hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Hope, sharp and electrifying, shot through Clara. "I'm coming up!" she yelled. As she climbed, the rising water tugged at her legs, threatening to pull her from the rungs. Alvarez reached down, grabbing her hand and pulling her up the last few feet. As soon as she was safely at the top, he started his own ascent into the darkness of the drainpipe beyond. Clara followed, squeezing through the tight, jagged opening, the sharp metal tearing at her coat. They were in a circular pipe, pitch black and slick with decades of slime. The roar of the water was deafening now, a monstrous, hungry sound. They crawled on their hands and knees, the current pushing at them, the darkness absolute. They used a system of coded knocks, Alvarez tapping twice on the pipe ahead, Clara tapping once in response, to stay together, a lifeline of sound in the terrifying, watery blackness. After what felt like an eternity of crawling, they saw it. A faint glimmer of light ahead, a maintenance shaft. A vertical ladder led upwards toward a manhole cover, silhouetted against the gray, rainy sky. Safety. They were going to make it. They scrambled up the ladder, pushing open the heavy cover and hauling themselves out onto the rain-slicked pavement of a deserted industrial street. They were alive. Soaked, freezing, and covered in filth, but alive. The relief was so profound it was dizzying, but as Clara stood there, gasping in the clean, rain-washed air, her relief was cut short. A black town car, its headlights cutting through the downpour, screeched to a halt beside them. The back door opened, and Richard Cain stepped out. He was holding a large black umbrella, perfectly composed, as if he were merely greeting business associates in a storm. Two large, menacing men got out with him, flanking him on either side. There was no escape. "Well," Cain said, his voice calm, almost admiring, "I must say I'm impressed. You're more resourceful than I anticipated." His eyes, cold and devoid of any emotion, flicked between them. He wasn't angry. He was simply recalibrating his plan. He had tried to bury them, and he had failed. Now, he would try a different approach. He took a step closer to Clara, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost kind tone. "This can all be over, Clara," he said softly. "You can walk away right now. Go home to your daughter. Forget you ever saw any of this. All I need is your silence. And those little trinkets you found. The whistle. The cap." He gestured to the bag Alvarez was carrying, where they had placed the precious items from the train. It was a deal with the devil, an offer of life in exchange for complicity. For a fleeting second, Clara felt the pull. The thought of Emily, of home, of safety. But then she looked at Cain's face, at the cold, reptilian certainty in his eyes. He wasn't offering her a way out, he was testing her. He was seeing if her silence could be bought. And in that moment, seeing his utter contempt for the lives he had destroyed, her fear was consumed by a righteous fury. This man, who had tried to murder them just minutes before, was now offering her a kindness he would betray in a heartbeat. She saw the truth of him, a man so rotted by his family's secret that he saw human life as nothing more than an obstacle. She clutched the bag containing her brother's things to her chest. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong above the sound of the rain. "There's no deal." Cain's feigned kindness vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury. He lunged forward, not at her, but at the bag. He ripped it from her grasp, his face a mask of rage. One of his men grabbed Thomas's cap, the other snatched the whistle. "Order before truth," Cain hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. He threw the cap to the ground and brought his polished shoe down on it, grinding it into the wet pavement. He took the whistle, and with a flick of his wrist, tossed it into a nearby storm drain, where it was instantly swallowed by the raging water. The desecration of these last precious pieces of her brother was a violation so profound, so deeply personal, that something inside Clara snapped. This was not a fight she could win with force. But as Cain turned his back, confident in his victory, he had no idea that she had one weapon left, the video on her phone. While he had been destroying the physical evidence, she had already sent the truth out into the world. He hadn't just failed to bury her. He had given her a story so powerful it could bring his entire world crashing down. Watching Cain desecrate the last physical pieces of her brother was a strange, clarifying moment for Clara. The cap, crushed under his expensive shoe, and the whistle, lost to the churning water, were just objects. He thought by destroying them, he was destroying the evidence, destroying the story. But he was wrong. The story wasn't in those things, it was inside her. It was in the diary they had found. It was in the frantic words scratched into the subway car wall. And it was in the video message she had recorded for Emily, a digital ghost she hoped had already escaped their underground prison. As Cain and his men climbed back into their car, casting one last dismissive glance at the two bedraggled figures they were leaving in the rain, Clara felt not defeat, but an almost feral sense of courage. He had left them alive, assuming their silence was guaranteed by his show of force. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The moment the town car disappeared around the corner, Alvarez was already on the move. "He thinks he's won," the old detective growled, his voice thick with a controlled fury. "He has no idea what's coming. They didn't go to the police. They both knew that would be useless." Cain's influence ran too deep. The system was designed to protect its own. Instead, Alvarez made a single call to a journalist he trusted, a seasoned investigative reporter who owed him a favor from an old case. A reporter who smelled a cover-up the way a shark smells blood in the water. The next 24 hours were a blur. They gave their story, every last detail, from the note in the attic to the horrifying discovery in the sealed tunnel. They handed over the diary, the photos Clara had taken of the scratches on the wall with her phone, and a copy of the video message she had recorded for Emily. The story was too big, too explosive to ignore. It landed on the front page of the city's biggest newspaper like a bomb. The Lost Train of 1968, decades-long cover, up exposed. The city awoke to a scandal of unimaginable proportions. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The idea that the city had knowingly entombed dozens of its own citizens and lied about it for 50 years was a betrayal that cut across all lines of politics and class. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, their signs demanding answers, demanding justice. The story of Steady Tommy Mitchell, the engineer who hadn't abandoned his family but had died with his passengers, became a symbol of institutional evil and individual honor. Richard Cain was suspended from his position immediately, his carefully constructed world of power and influence crumbling in a matter of hours. He issued a statement denying everything, calling it a sensationalized fantasy spun by a grieving woman and a disgruntled former cop. But the evidence was too compelling. The diary, the timeline, the sheer audacity of the crime, it all painted a picture that the public believed without question. For Clara, the whirlwind of media attention was overwhelming, but she moved through it with a quiet, steady grace. Her personal quest for a family truth had become a public crusade for justice. The city, under immense pressure, had no choice but to act. Heavy machinery was brought to the sealed tunnel. not to hide a secret, but to excavate a crime scene. As they broke through the concrete wall Cain had so recently erected, the cameras rolled, broadcasting the scene live to a city holding its breath. And as the dark, silent subway car was finally pulled out into the daylight for the first time in half a century, a collective gasp seemed to ripple through the watching crowd. It was real. It was all real. Justice, when it finally came, was swift and decisive. Richard Cain was indicted, his name forever linked not to public service, but to a monstrous, generational crime. The city's investigation unearthed a vast web of corruption tied to the redevelopment projects, implicating several other prominent figures, and exposing how Arthur Cain had orchestrated the entire cover-up to protect both his career and the financial interests of powerful men. And Howard, her cousin, was disgraced. His name was splashed across the news, his betrayal of his own family laid bare for the world to see. He lost his contracts, his reputation, and his place in the family he had sold out for a lifetime of wealth. The last time Clara saw him, it was from a distance, as he was being swarmed by reporters, his face a mask of panic denial. There was no triumph in it for her, only a profound, bottomless sadness for the man he could have been. A few weeks later, a memorial service was held near the site. A simple granite wall was erected, and on it were etched the names of all the passengers from the lost train, their identities painstakingly recovered from old records. For 50 years they had been ghosts, their families left to wonder and to grieve without closure. Now, they had their names back. They were home. Clara stood in the crowd, a light rain falling, the gray sky seeming to weep with them. She felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was Emily. Her daughter's eyes were red from crying, but for the first time in months, they held no fear, no anger, only a deep shared sorrow and an immense heartbreaking pride. "He didn't abandon us," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at her great-uncle's name on the wall. "He was stolen from us." In that moment, the last of the fractured pieces of their family finally began to mend. The shame that had been a poison in their bloodline for generations was gone, replaced by the clean, painful truth of stolen honor. Later that year, the New York City Transit Museum opened a new exhibit. It was a small, quiet corner dedicated to the lost train of 1968. At the center of the glass case were two items that had been recovered during the official excavation: a tarnished brass whistle and a crushed but still recognizable engineer's cap. They had found them in the storm drain, caught in a debris filter, a final, small miracle. Clara had donated them to the museum, knowing they didn't belong to her anymore. They belonged to the city, a permanent reminder of the price of secrets and the power of truth. As she stood before the exhibit, looking at the last remnants of her brother's life, she didn't feel the triumph of victory. The cost had been too high. The scars on her family would never fully fade. But as she walked away from the museum and back out into the bustling, noisy city, she felt a quiet awe. She had kept her promise. She had found the train. She had brought her brother home. The truth had not erased the loss, but it had, at long last, set them all free.